The year was 1867, when the Colorado Territory stretched wild and lawless beneath an endless sky, where justice came from the barrel of a rifle and survival depended on reading the signs that others missed. In these untamed mountains were fortune. Hunters carved out desperate lives and outlaws found sanctuary in the shadows of towering pines. Courage was measured not by words, but by the willingness to stand alone when darkness came calling. This is the extraordinary tale of Rebecca Morrison, a woman whose quiet strength would be tested by fire and blood, and Marcus Whitehorse, a tracker caught between two worlds whose arrival would change everything when hope seemed lost forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca Morrison stood on the wooden porch of her cabin, her calloused hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee as the first light of dawn painted the Rocky Mountain peaks in shades of gold and crimson. At 28, she possessed the kind of understated beauty that came from honest work and mountain air, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid, and her green eyes holding the steady gaze of someone accustomed to solitude. The cabin behind her, built from lodgepole pine and chinked with river clay, represented 3 years of backbreaking labor alongside her husband Thomas before fever took him the previous spring. The morning air carried the crisp bite of early autumn, and Rebecca inhaled deeply, finding comfort in the familiar sense of pine resin and wood smoke. Her small homestead occupied a natural clearing halfway up the mountainside, positioned strategically where a seasonal creek provided fresh water, and the elevated location offered commanding views of the valley approaches below. Thomas had chosen this spot with a soldier's eye for defensive advantages, though at the time Rebecca had thought his caution excessive for their peaceful mountain sanctuary. Their nearest neighbors, the Carlson family, lived 5 miles down the mountain where the terrain leveled into grazing land suitable for cattle. Beyond that, the mining camp of Silverbrook sprawled along Willow Creek, another 8 miles east, a collection of tents, rough shacks, and ambitious false-fronted buildings that served the fluctuating population of prospectors, merchants, and the inevitable collection of gamblers, saloon keepers, and working women who followed any boomtown worth its salt. Rebecca had visited Silverbrook monthly since Thomas's death, trading surplus vegetables from her garden and preserved meat from her hunting for supplies she couldn't produce herself. The townspeople treated her with a mixture of respect and concern, uncertain how a woman alone could maintain such an isolated homestead through the approaching winter. Mayor Thompson, a portly man who'd grown wealthy supplying miners with overpriced goods, had made increasingly pointed suggestions about the wisdom of moving to town before the snows made travel impossible, the morning routine that had sustained Rebecca through months of solitude began as always with checking the livestock. Her small herd consisted of 2 milk cows, a dozen chickens, and her prized Mare, Duchess, a spirited chestnut with enough mountain horse sense to navigate the treacherous trails that connected her homestead to the outside world. Thomas had trained Duchess himself, and the horse responded to Rebecca's commands with an almost human understanding of their shared isolation. The chicken coop, built against the cabin's north wall for protection from winter winds, housed her most reliable source of protein and trade goods. Rebecca scattered feed with practiced efficiency while conducting her daily count, noting with satisfaction that all 12 hens remained present and accounted for. Predators posed a constant threat this high in the mountains, from foxes and coyotes to the occasional black bear drawn by the scent of easy prey. Her garden, now mostly harvested except for the hardiest root vegetables, stretched along the cabin's southern exposure where it caught maximum sunlight during the growing season. Row upon row of potato hills marked her most successful crop, supplemented by turnips, carrots, and onions that would keep through winter if properly stored. The root cellar Thomas had excavated beneath the cabin's floor held her preserves, smoked meat, and the precious seed stock that would enable next year's planting. Inside the cabin, Rebecca moved through the familiar rhythm of preparing breakfast, her hands finding each implement and ingredient by memory in the single room that served as kitchen, parlor, and bedroom. The stone fireplace dominated the western wall, its hearth large enough to accommodate the Dutch oven where she baked bread and the iron kettle that provided hot water for washing. Above the mantel, Thomas's Springfield rifle rested in wooden brackets he'd carved with careful attention to both function and beauty. The weapon represented more than protection. It embodied Thomas's legacy of self-reliance and his understanding that isolation demanded the ability to defend what you'd built. He'd taught Rebecca to shoot during their first autumn together, patiently correcting her stance and breathing, until she could consistently hit targets at distances that would surprise the men in Silverbrook who assumed frontier women left such matters to their husbands. Rebecca's skill with the rifle extended beyond target practice to practical hunting that supplemented their meat supply. She'd taken 3 deer since Thomas's death, processing the carcasses with efficiency born of necessity and storing the meat in the smokehouse Thomas had built behind the cabin. The tasks that might have overwhelmed a woman raised in town comfort had become routine through repetition and the simple imperative of survival. The isolation that troubled concerned neighbors suited Rebecca's temperament perfectly. She'd grown up the daughter of a circuit preacher in Kansas, accustomed to long periods of quiet broken only by occasional human contact when her father's travels brought them to scattered congregations across the prairie. The mountain solitude offered peace rather than loneliness, space to think and work without the constant social obligations that town life demanded. Her days followed patterns that maximized productivity while acknowledging the seasonal rhythms that governed mountain life. Morning hours were devoted to animal care and household maintenance, followed by afternoon work in the garden or forest gathering firewood, medicinal plants, and the wild foods that supplemented her cultivated crops. Evenings brought indoor tasks, mending clothes, maintaining equipment, and the careful bookkeeping that tracked supplies against anticipated needs through the coming winter. The small library Thomas had accumulated during his years as a schoolteacher before their marriage provided intellectual companionship during long winter evenings. Shakespeare's complete works, a collection of Emerson's essays, Darwin's revolutionary theories, and practical volumes on agriculture and medicine filled the shelves he'd built along the cabin's eastern wall. Rebecca had read each book multiple times, finding new insights with each encounter and maintaining the connection to broader ideas that might otherwise have been lost in the daily necessities of frontier survival. Her correspondence with her sister Elizabeth in Denver provided another link to the outside world, though mail delivery to their remote location remained irregular at best. Elizabeth's letters painted pictures of urban growth and social change that seemed to belong to a different century rather than the same territory. The contrast between Elizabeth's accounts of dinner parties, theater performances, and women's suffrage meetings and Rebecca's daily reality of splitting firewood and preserving meat for winter illustrated the vast distances that geography could create between sisters who'd once shared everything. The approaching winter presented challenges that Rebecca faced with methodical preparation rather than anxiety. Thomas had taught her to think in terms of systems and redundancy, ensuring that no single failure could threaten their survival. The woodshed held enough seasoned timber to last through April, supplemented by the deadfall she collected from the surrounding forest. Her food stores included not only preserved meat and vegetables, but also emergency supplies of hardtack, dried beans, and salt that could sustain life if other sources failed. Medical supplies occupied a special place in her preparations, assembled through careful trading in Silverbrook and supplemented by her growing knowledge of mountain plants with healing properties. Thomas's military service had included field medicine training that he'd passed along during their years together, preparing Rebecca to handle everything from minor injuries to serious illness without professional help. The knowledge proved invaluable. During the long months when snow made travel to town impossible, and self-reliance became literally a matter of life and death, the cabin itself represented the culmination of Thomas's planning and craftsmanship, designed to withstand mountain weather while providing the amenities necessary for civilized life. Double thick walls filled with moss and clay provided insulation against winter cold, while the steep roof shed snow and rain with equal efficiency. Windows positioned to catch morning and afternoon light were fitted with shutters that could seal the interior against storms or other threats that darkness might bring. Social contact, when it occurred, came primarily through visits from their neighbors, the Carlsons, whose eldest son David made monthly trips up the mountain to check on Rebecca's welfare and assist with tasks that required additional hands. At 19, David possessed the earnest responsibility of a young man raised to respect hard work and genuine kindness. His visits provided news from the valley and Silverbrook, while offering Rebecca the company of someone who understood mountain life without the condescending concern she encountered in town. The Carlson family had proven themselves reliable neighbors. During Thomas's illness and death, providing practical help without intrusive questions about Rebecca's plans for the future. Their acceptance of her determination to maintain the homestead alone stood in stark contrast to the skepticism she faced from townspeople, who couldn't understand why a woman would choose isolation over the safety and social structure of community life. Rebecca's relationship with the broader community of Silverbrook remained cordial but distant, marked by mutual respect that never quite bridged the gap between her self-sufficient mountain existence and their town-centered worldview. She traded fairly, paid her debts promptly, and caused no trouble that might burden the overworked sheriff who struggled to maintain order among Silverbrook's fluctuating population of miners, gamblers, and transients. The mining boom that had created Silverbrook showed signs of playing out as easily accessible ore deposits became exhausted and claims changed hands with increasing frequency. Some prospectors struck moderate wealth and departed for more comfortable lives in Denver or California, while others doubled down on increasingly desperate efforts to extract fortune from reluctant earth. The resulting tensions occasionally erupted in violence that tested Sheriff Morrison's ability to maintain peace with limited resources and dubious authority over men who recognized no law. Beyond personal strength, Rebecca observed these developments during her trading visits with the detached interest of someone whose life operated largely independent of boom and bust cycles that governed Silverbrook's fortunes. Her homestead produced what she needed regardless of mining claims or fluctuating gold prices, though she remained aware that economic desperation might drive desperate men to consider isolated homesteads as sources of supplies or refuge. Changing character of Silverbrook's population troubled longtime residents who remembered the early days when shared hardship created bonds of mutual support among people struggling to build something permanent in the wilderness. The original settlers had included families committed to establishing roots and creating communities that would outlast the mining excitement. Now transients outnumbered permanent residents, and the social fabric that had held the town together through difficult times showed increasing strain. Rebecca's independence from this deteriorating situation provided security, but also increased her isolation as the stable families who had formed Silverbrook's foundation either departed for safer locations or withdrew into defensive suspicion of strangers. Her monthly visits to town became exercises in careful navigation of tensions she could sense but not fully understand. Interactions with people whose circumstances grew more desperate as easy wealth proved elusive and winter approached with its inevitable demand for resources that many had failed to accumulate. The afternoon sun slanted through the cabin windows as Rebecca completed her daily tasks, each routine action reinforcing the self-reliant existence she had built in Thomas's memory. Her life possessed a completeness that town dwellers might find difficult to understand, shaped by the natural rhythms of seasonal change and daily necessities that left Little room for the social anxieties or material ambitions that drove more conventional lives. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As evening approached, Rebecca stood once again on her porch, this time watching shadows lengthen across the valley below while Duchess grazed peacefully in the meadow and her chickens settled into their evening roost. The scene embodied the tranquil prosperity she and Thomas had worked to create, a mountain sanctuary where honest labor produced security, and the isolation that others feared had become a source of strength rather than vulnerability. Yet beneath this surface calm, subtle signs suggested changes approaching with the turning season. Smoke from distant campfires had appeared more frequently in recent weeks, visible from her elevated position during clear evenings when the air carried unfamiliar sounds that didn't belong to the usual pattern of forest life. David Carlson had mentioned increased traffic on the mountain roads during his last visit, travelers who avoided Silverbrook's main streets and camped in hidden locations rather than seeking conventional accommodation. The approaching winter that would normally bring months of peaceful isolation now carried undertones of uncertainty that Rebecca couldn't quite define but couldn't ignore. Her preparations remained thorough, her defenses adequate, and her skills proven through months of successful independence. Whatever changes the season might bring, she would face them as she had faced every challenge since Thomas's death, with careful planning, quiet determination, and the unshakable conviction that the life they had built together was worth defending against any threat that darkness might conceal. The first sign of trouble came on a crisp October morning when Duchess refused to graze in her usual spot near the creek. The mare stood rigid at the corral fence, ears pricked forward and nostrils flared as she tested scents carried on the mountain breeze. Rebecca had learned to trust the horse's instincts over her own limited senses, and Duchess's behavior triggered an immediate alertness that sent her reaching for the field glasses Thomas had used during his cavalry days. From her elevated position, Rebecca scanned the valley approaches methodically, following the animal trails and wagon routes that provided access to her mountain sanctuary. Nothing appeared obviously wrong, yet the Duchess remained agitated, pawing the ground and whickering softly in the way she reserved for detecting human presence at considerable distance. Rebecca's pulse quickened as she remembered David Carlson's casual mention during his last visit of strangers asking questions about isolated homesteads and Silverbrook saloons. The morning routine proceeded with heightened vigilance as Rebecca completed her chores while maintaining constant awareness of her surroundings. Every sound received scrutiny, from the normal rustle of wind through pine boughs to the distant crack of a breaking branch that might indicate movement where none should exist. Her hand frequently drifted to the Colt revolver Thomas had insisted she carry during outdoor work, its familiar weight providing reassurance against the growing sense that her peaceful mountain existence faced unprecedented threat. By noon, Duchess's agitation had spread to the other animals. The milk cows clustered near the barn rather than wandering their usual grazing circuit, while the chickens remained subdued despite the pleasant weather that normally encouraged active foraging. Rebecca had witnessed this behavior before when predators approached, but the sustained tension suggested something more significant than wildlife passing through the territory. Afternoon brought confirmation of her growing unease when smoke appeared on the southern horizon. Not the thin column of a cooking fire, but the thick black plume that indicated substantial burning. Rebecca trained her field glasses on the distant signal, calculating that the source lay approximately where the Carlson homestead occupied its sheltered valley. The implication struck her with cold certainty that transformed concern into genuine fear for the first time since establishing her mountain refuge. David Carlson had been scheduled to visit that very afternoon, bringing news from town and helping Rebecca prepare winter feed for the livestock. His failure to appear, combined with the ominous smoke marking his family's location, painted a picture too clear to ignore. Something had happened to the neighbors whose kindness and practical support had made her isolation bearable, and that something now threatened to extend its reach to her own carefully defended sanctuary. As evening approached, Rebecca made preparations that Thomas's military training had taught her to consider but never implement. The livestock were secured in the barn with extra feed and water, while supplies of ammunition, medical materials, and emergency provisions were positioned within easy reach of defensive positions inside the cabin. The Springfield rifle received careful cleaning and loading, joined by Thomas's cavalry carbine and the double-barreled shotgun that provided devastating close-range protection. Night fell with oppressive weight that seemed to muffle normal forest sounds and amplify every unexpected noise into potential threat. Rebecca maintained watch from the cabin's front window, using the field glasses to scan approaches illuminated by starlight reflecting off patches of early snow. Sleep became impossible as adrenaline sustained alertness that would have been exhausting under normal circumstances but felt essential for survival in the face of unknown danger. The attack came at dawn with terrifying suddenness that validated every precaution Rebecca had taken during her sleepless night of preparation. 6 riders emerged from the tree line simultaneously, approaching the cabin from multiple directions in a coordinated assault that spoke of military experience adapted to criminal purposes. Their leader, a bearded man riding a magnificent black stallion, raised his hand in a signal that brought the group to a halt just beyond effective rifle range. "Woman in the cabin," the leader called, his voice carrying clearly across the mountain air. "We know you're alone up there. Come out peaceful, and we'll make this easy for everyone." Rebecca positioned herself behind the heavy wooden table Thomas had built near the front window, the Springfield's barrel resting on its edge, and aimed steadily at the spokesman who clearly commanded the raiding party. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady as she drew a bead on the center of his chest and prepared to demonstrate that easy solutions would not be forthcoming. "This is private property," she called back, projecting confidence she didn't entirely feel. "You're trespassing. Move along before someone gets hurt." Harsh laughter erupted from several of the riders, men whose appearance suggested the desperate character of played-out prospectors turned to robbery for survival. Their clothes showed the wear of extended travel, their horses bore the marks of hard riding, and their weapons were held with the casual familiarity of men accustomed to violence as a solution to practical problems. "Now that's unfriendly," the leader replied, urging his horse a few steps closer while remaining carefully outside Rebecca's effective range. "We're just travelers looking for supplies and maybe some hospitality from a neighbor. Heard tell there's a widow woman up here all alone. Figured she might appreciate some company during the long winter nights." The leering undertone in his voice transformed Rebecca's fear into cold anger that steadied her aim and hardened her resolve. These men had not stumbled upon her homestead by accident. They had come seeking a specific target they believed defenseless. The smoke from the Carlson place suggested they had already tested their methods on her friends, and the casual confidence with which they approached her cabin indicated they expected similar easy success. "You've got 10 seconds to turn around and ride out," Rebecca announced, her voice carrying across the clearing with unmistakable determination. "After that, I start shooting, and I don't miss what I aim at." "Big talk for a woman alone," sneered a younger rider whose scarred face suggested experience with violence that hadn't always favored his side. "Let's just rush her, Jake. What's one woman with a rifle against 6 men? The leader held up a restraining hand, studying the cabin's defensive positions with eyes that recognized prepared resistance when he encountered it. Jake Morrison possessed enough tactical sense to distinguish between helpless victims and dangerous opponents, and something in Rebecca's tone had clearly shifted his assessment of the situation. "Easy, boys," he cautioned. "Lady might have more teeth than she's showing. Let's try a different approach." What followed was a systematic attempt to force Rebecca's surrender through psychological pressure and demonstration of superior firepower. The raiders spread out around the cabin, taking positions that provided cover while maintaining surveillance of all exits. They fired occasional shots into the air or at the cabin's logs, creating noise and splinters designed to wear down her. Resistance through sustained intimidation. Rebecca responded by conserving ammunition, while demonstrating her marksmanship capabilities. When one rider ventured too close to the chicken coop, apparently intending to steal her livestock as a preliminary to more serious assault, she put a bullet through his hat that sent him scrambling for cover while his companions shouted appreciation for shooting that had clearly been intended as warning rather than lethal force. "Told you she had teeth," Jake called to his men, though his tone carried grudging respect rather than concern. "Women know how to handle that rifle." The siege settled into a pattern of probing attacks and defensive responses that demonstrated the fundamental mismatch between Rebecca's position and her opponent's intentions. She possessed superior defensive positions, adequate supplies, and shooting skills that commanded respect, but 6 determined men with time and patience could eventually overwhelm any single defender through coordinated assault or simple attrition. As the morning wore on, Rebecca's situation grew increasingly desperate despite her successful resistance to the initial attacks. The raiders showed no inclination to abandon their assault, while her ammunition supply, though carefully hoarded, was not unlimited. More critically, the isolation that had provided peace and security now worked against her, ensuring that no help would arrive to break the siege regardless of how long she might hold out. The psychological pressure intensified when Jake began sharing details that revealed the extent of his knowledge about her circumstances. He knew about Thomas's death, about her monthly trips to Silverbrook, about the Carlson family's visits and their current fate. The information could only have come from careful reconnaissance or from sources within the town itself, suggesting a level of planning that made her situation even more precarious. "Your neighbors put up quite a fight," Jake called during a lull in the shooting. "Old man Carlson had some military training too, I reckon. Didn't help him much in the end, though his boy David showed real sand before we finished with him." The casual revelation of David's death hit Rebecca like a physical blow, confirming her worst fears about the smoke she had observed the previous day. The young man who had shown such kindness and respect was gone, along with his family, victims of the same predators who now sought to add her to their tally of conquered homesteads. Rage replaced fear as Rebecca absorbed the implications of Jake's boast. These men were not simply desperate travelers seeking supplies. They were systematic raiders who had identified isolated homesteads as sources of wealth and provisions. The Carlsons had represented their first success, and her mountain sanctuary was intended as their second, with additional victims probably already marked for future attention. The afternoon brought escalated violence as the raiders' patience wore thin and their tactics became more aggressive. They attempted to fire the barn, forcing Rebecca to expose herself at the back window to drive them off with rifle fire that came dangerously close to ending the siege through direct action. 2 of the raiders bore minor wounds from her accurate shooting, adding personal motivation to their determination to overwhelm her resistance. "This is getting expensive, Jake," complained the scarred rider whose earlier eagerness for assault had been tempered by Rebecca's demonstrated marksmanship. "Maybe we should just burn her out and take what we can from the ashes. Fire gets out of control up here. It might bring attention we don't want," Jake replied, though his tone suggested he was considering more drastic measures. "Besides, a woman that shoots like this one probably has friends who'd come looking eventually. Better to make it look like an accident or Indian raid." The conversation, clearly intended for Rebecca's ears, revealed both the extent of their criminal planning and the cold calculation with which they approached murder and robbery. These were not desperate men driven to temporary crime by circumstance. They were professional predators who had developed systematic methods for identifying, attacking, and eliminating isolated targets while avoiding official attention. As darkness approached, Rebecca faced the grim reality that her defensive position, however well prepared, could not withstand indefinite siege by determined opponents. Her ammunition was running low, her physical exhaustion was beginning to affect her shooting accuracy, and the raiders had demonstrated both patience and tactical skill that suggested they would eventually find ways to overcome her resistance. Night attacks began after full darkness fell, with individual raiders attempting to approach the cabin under cover of darkness while their companions provided distraction through noise and muzzle flashes from different directions. Rebecca found herself constantly moving between windows, trying to track multiple threats while conserving ammunition for shots she could be certain would count. The stress of sustained combat was taking its toll in ways that went beyond simple fatigue. Every shadow might conceal an approaching enemy. Every sound could signal the beginning of a final assault. And the isolation that had once provided comfort now amplified every fear and uncertainty. Rebecca's world had contracted to the cabin's four walls and the deadly space immediately surrounding them, where her life depended on split-second decisions and perfect marksmanship. By midnight, the situation had deteriorated to the point where Rebecca began considering desperate alternatives to continued resistance. The raiders had demonstrated their willingness to maintain the siege indefinitely, while her resources and energy were clearly finite. Escape seemed impossible with mounted opponents controlling all approaches, while surrender promised only delayed death after whatever entertainment her captors might devise. The final assault came near dawn, when Jake apparently decided that patience had yielded diminishing returns and direct action offered better prospects for success. 3 men approached the cabin from the front while the remaining raiders positioned themselves to prevent escape through windows or back door. This represented the coordinated attack Rebecca had dreaded, requiring her to choose between targets. While being unable to cover all approaches simultaneously, she chose to make her stand at the front window, reasoning that stopping the primary assault might discourage the supporting elements long enough for her to reposition for defense against secondary threats. The Springfield rifle spoke with deadly authority, dropping the lead attacker and sending his companions diving for cover, but return fire immediately shattered the window glass and filled the cabin interior with flying splinters and lead bullets. Rebecca rolled away from the destroyed window, clutching Thomas's cavalry carbine and trying to reach a position where she could observe the back approaches before the remaining raiders completed their encirclement. Blood ran down her cheek from glass cuts, and her ears rang from the concussion of multiple rifles firing in the confined space. But determination to make them pay dearly for their victory still burned bright despite the hopelessness of her situation. Sound that froze every participant in the deadly drama was not another gunshot, but the wild cry of a mountain lion echoing from the forest surrounding the cabin. The raiders hesitated, uncertain whether the predator's presence represented additional threat or simple coincidence, while Rebecca used the momentary confusion to reach a new firing position near the cabin's back wall. What happened next would transform the entire character of the battle and introduce an element that none of the participants had anticipated. The mountain lion's cry was answered by another sound that seemed to come from a human throat but carried undertones that spoke of wild places and skills learned far from civilization's constraints. From the forest came a figure that moved with fluid grace between the trees, approaching the besieged cabin with confidence that suggested complete familiarity with the mountain terrain and tactical situation. The raiders' attention divided between their primary target and this unexpected development, creating the first opportunity Rebecca had possessed since the siege. Began to consider that survival might be possible after all. The battle for her mountain sanctuary had reached its crisis point, but the outcome that had seemed inevitable was about to change in ways that would challenge everything the raiders thought they knew about controlling isolated targets in the Colorado wilderness. Help was approaching from an unexpected quarter, carried by someone whose skills and knowledge would prove more than equal to the challenge of 6 desperate men who had chosen the wrong mountain and the wrong woman for their predatory ambitions. First raider to notice the approaching figure never had a chance to raise his rifle. A shadow detached itself from the pine trees behind him, and steel flashed in the pre-dawn light before the man crumpled silently to the forest floor. The remaining attackers, focused on their assault against Rebecca's cabin, remained unaware that death had begun stalking them from the darkness they thought provided cover. Marcus Whitehorse moved through the timber with the fluid precision of a predator born to these mountains, his mixed Cherokee and Scottish heritage evident in features that reflected both cultures, while belonging fully to neither. At 31, he possessed the lean, powerful build of a man whose survival depended on physical capability and whose profession required skills that most civilized men never developed. His buckskin clothing, darkened with bear grease and pine pitch, rendered him nearly invisible against the forest backdrop as he closed the distance to the remaining raiders. The second kill came equally silently when Marcus drew his throwing knife and sent 6 inches of razor-sharp steel into the spine of a raider, attempting to circle toward the cabin's rear entrance. The man dropped his rifle and fell forward without a sound, his body concealed by the deadfall where he had sought concealment. Jake Morrison's carefully planned assault was being systematically dismantled by an opponent whose existence they had never suspected and whose methods they were powerless to counter. Rebecca, pressed against the cabin's back wall and bleeding from glass cuts inflicted during the window assault, heard the subtle sounds that indicated something had changed in the tactical situation. The random gunfire that had characterized the night-long siege had ceased, replaced by an ominous silence broken only by the nervous shuffling of horses and the whispered conversations of men who sensed their advantage slipping away without understanding why. Jake Morrison's voice cut through the dawn air with sharp authority as he attempted to regain control of an operation that was deteriorating in ways he couldn't comprehend. "Collins, Richardson, report your positions." The silence that greeted his demands confirmed what Marcus had already accomplished. 4 men remained of the original 6, and their leader was beginning to understand that his carefully planned raid had been compromised by forces beyond his anticipation. The mountain wilderness that had seemed to offer perfect isolation for their criminal activities now sheltered an adversary whose capabilities exceeded anything in Jake's experience. Marcus positioned himself where he could observe the remaining raiders while remaining concealed from their increasingly frantic attempts to locate their missing companions. His appearance reflected a lifetime spent moving between worlds, neither fully white nor fully Indian, surviving through skills learned from both cultures while being fully accepted by neither. The tomahawk at his belt bore Cherokee designs worked into steel forged by Scottish smiths, while the rifle across his shoulders combined German precision with modifications adapted to mountain hunting conditions. The tracker's arrival at Rebecca's homestead represented no coincidence, but the culmination of a journey that had begun 3 days earlier, when smoke from the Carlson place had been visible from his camp 20 miles south. Marcus made his living guiding prospectors, hunting for mining camps, and tracking everything from stolen horses to missing persons across Colorado Territory's vast wilderness. The systematic raids that had begun targeting isolated homesteads threatened the fragile peace he had worked years to establish in these mountains. His investigation of the Carlson attack had revealed the professional nature of the raiders' methods and their systematic approach to selecting targets. Boot prints, horse tracks, and the pattern of destruction indicated men with military training who had adapted their skills to criminal purposes. The trail leading from the Carlson homestead to Rebecca's mountain sanctuary was clear to someone with Marcus's tracking abilities. Though the raiders had believed themselves unobserved during their approach, the Cherokee side of Marcus's heritage provided skills in moving silently through natural terrain and reading sign that others missed entirely. From his Scottish father came the disciplined thinking and tactical awareness that transformed those natural abilities into deadly effectiveness. His mixed blood had made him an outsider in both cultures, but those same dual influences created capabilities that surpassed what either tradition could produce alone. Rebecca heard movement outside the cabin that differed from the raiders' previous approaches, something more fluid and purposeful that seemed to flow with the natural rhythms of the forest rather than against them. Her finger tightened on the carbine's trigger as she strained to identify the source through the pre-dawn darkness, uncertain whether this represented additional threat or unexpected opportunity. Marcus's voice, when it finally came, carried the calm authority of someone completely in control of the tactical situation. "Lady in the cabin, stay down and stay quiet. This will be over soon." The accent blended mountain drawl with something more exotic, reflecting the cultural mixture that had shaped Marcus's upbringing in Cherokee communities along the Arkansas River before circumstances brought him to Colorado's high country. His tone held no doubt about the outcome of the confrontation, though the remaining raiders still possessed numerical advantage and defensive positions. Jake Morrison's response revealed both desperation and the first stirrings of genuine fear as he realized his carefully planned raid had been turned into a hunt where he and his men had become the prey. "Who the hell are you? This is none of your business." "Wrong mountain for this kind of work," Marcus replied, his voice seeming to come from a different location than before as he moved through positions that provided multiple firing angles while denying the raiders clear targets. "You picked the wrong woman to corner." The psychological warfare that Jake had employed against Rebecca was now being turned against his own men with devastating effectiveness. Marcus's ability to move unseen while eliminating their companions created fear that undermined the raiders' cohesion and tactical discipline. Men who had been confident in their superior numbers now found themselves jumping at shadows and firing at sounds that might or might not represent threats. The third raider died when he attempted to flee toward the horses tethered beyond the clearing's edge. Marcus's rifle spoke once, and the man pitched forward to lie motionless among the pine needles while his companions realized that escape had been eliminated as an option. They were trapped in a killing ground by an opponent whose skills exceeded their own and whose knowledge of the terrain provided advantages they couldn't overcome. Rebecca seized the opportunity created by Marcus's intervention to improve her own defensive position. She moved to the front window, now partially cleared of glass, but still providing good visibility of the approaches where the remaining raiders sought cover. The Springfield rifle in her hands represented familiar weight and deadly capability that complemented the deadly skills of her unexpected ally. "Two of you left besides their leader," Marcus called, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "You can ride out now and live to see tomorrow, or you can stay and join your friends. Your choice." The offer was directed at the surviving raiders, but Rebecca understood its tactical purpose. Marcus was attempting to break up the enemy's unity by offering survival to those willing to abandon their leader. In desperate situations, such psychological pressure often proved more effective than continued violence in achieving rapid resolution. Jake Morrison recognized the threat to his authority and responded with the harsh discipline that had held his gang together through previous raids. "Stand fast, boys. It's just one man, and we still got him outnumbered." "One man who's already killed 4 of your people," Marcus observed, his tone carrying grim humor. "How many more are you willing to lose for whatever you thought you'd find?" Up here, the standoff stretched through the growing daylight as both sides evaluated their positions and considered options that seemed increasingly limited. Marcus possessed superior skills and knowledge of the terrain, but the raiders still held defensive positions that would require careful approach to overcome. Rebecca controlled the cabin and its supplies, but remained vulnerable to sustained assault if the siege continued. The resolution came when Jake Morrison's desperation overcame his tactical sense. Rather than accepting the stalemate or negotiating withdrawal, he chose to gamble everything on a final assault that would either achieve quick victory or result in total defeat. His signal brought the two surviving raiders charging toward the cabin while Jake himself attempted to circle and attack Marcus from an unexpected angle. Rebecca's rifle dropped the first attacker before he cleared the woodline, the heavy bullets spinning him around and sending him crashing into the deadfall, where his body lay still. The second man reached the cabin's front wall before Marcus's shot from the forest took him down, leaving Jake Morrison alone and exposed in terrain that offered no concealment from his enemies. Combined firepower, the last raider leader found himself caught between Rebecca's position at the cabin window and Marcus's location among the trees, unable to advance or retreat without exposing himself to deadly crossfire. His expensive black stallion, trained for cavalry charges rather than mountain warfare, reared and plunged as gunfire spooked the animal beyond his rider's ability to control. Jake's final mistake was attempting to use his horse as a shield while he sought escape toward the forest. Marcus stepped into the open, his rifle aimed with the steady precision of someone who had never missed a shot that mattered. The range was less than 50 yards, an easy target for a marksman of his caliber. "Drop your weapons and dismount," Marcus commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Last chance." Jake Morrison's response was to wheel his horse and attempt a cavalry charge that might have succeeded against infantry in open terrain, but had no chance of success in the confined space of Rebecca's clearing. His revolver fired wild shots that came nowhere near their intended targets, while Marcus's rifle answered with surgical precision. The black stallion reared and fell, its rider thrown clear but landing hard among the rocks that bordered the creek. Jake Morrison lay motionless where he had fallen, his reign of terror ended by a single shot from a man whose existence he had never suspected when planning what should have been a simple raid against an isolated woman. Silence settled over the clearing, like a physical presence, as smoke from the gunfire drifted away on the mountain breeze. 6 bodies lay scattered among the trees and rocks, testimony to the price of underestimating both the woman they had thought defenseless and the mountain that had sheltered an unexpected protector. The siege that had seemed destined to end in Rebecca's death or capture was over, decided by the intervention of someone whose skills had proven superior to all their planning and preparation. The dot Marcus emerged from the forest with the fluid grace that had characterized all his movements, the rifle held casually in hands that showed no tremor from the deadly work just completed. His appearance in full daylight revealed features that reflected his mixed heritage clearly, with Cherokee bone structure softened by Scottish coloring and eyes that held the watchful intelligence of someone accustomed to surviving between worlds. That offered no complete acceptance. Rebecca stepped carefully through the cabin's doorway, the carbine still ready in her hands as she surveyed the scene that had transformed her peaceful homestead into a battlefield. Bodies lay where they had fallen, while the horses that had carried the raiders milled nervously at the clearing's edge, their riders' deaths leaving them uncertain and afraid. "You hurt?" Marcus asked, his attention focused on the blood that marked Rebecca's cheek and the exhaustion evident in her posture after the night-long siege. "Glass cuts," she replied, her voice steadier than she had expected after the ordeal she had endured. "Nothing serious." Marcus nodded acceptance of her assessment, while his eyes continued scanning the clearing for any threats they might have missed. His wariness was automatic, the product of years spent in situations where assuming danger had ended often proved fatal. The immediate threat was over, but the circumstances that had brought raiders to this remote location might involve additional complications. "Name's Marcus Whitehorse," he offered, approaching close enough for conversation while maintaining tactical awareness of their surroundings. "I track for the mining camps, hunt when the pay's good enough." "Rebecca Morrison," she responded, recognizing the courtesy despite the unusual circumstances of their meeting. "This is my home, or was until this morning." The qualification reflected more than physical damage to her property. The sense of security and peaceful isolation that had defined her mountain existence was gone, shattered by the violence that had demonstrated her vulnerability despite all her preparations. The cabin remained standing and her life was intact. But the psychological sanctuary she had built in Thomas's memory would require time and effort to restore. Marcus understood the deeper implications of her statement without requiring explanation. He had witnessed similar destruction during his years in territories where violence often determined survival, and he recognized both the physical and emotional aftermath that required healing. The woman before him had defended herself with courage and skill that commanded respect, but the cost of that defense would extend beyond the immediate battle. "Looks like you held them off pretty well on your own," he observed, noting the defensive position she had prepared and the evidence of accurate shooting that had kept her alive through the long siege. "They killed the Carlson family yesterday," Rebecca replied, her voice carrying grief that mixed with the exhaustion of sustained terror. "David was supposed to visit this afternoon." The information provided context that Marcus had already deduced from the raiders' systematic approach and his own investigation of the burned homestead down the mountain. These men had not been random predators but organized criminals who had identified isolated targets and developed methods for overwhelming resistance while avoiding official attention. "Saw the smoke," Marcus confirmed. "Tracked them from there." To here would have arrived sooner, but they covered their trail better than most. Rebecca studied the man who had saved her life with interest that went beyond simple gratitude. Marcus Whitehorse represented capabilities and knowledge that seemed almost supernatural after her months of isolation and self-reliance. His intervention had transformed certain death into survival, but questions remained about his background and the circumstances that had brought him to her mountain sanctuary at precisely the right moment. "You've been tracking them specifically?" she asked, recognizing that professional trackers didn't pursue criminals without compensation or official authority. "These mountains are my territory," Marcus explained, his tone carrying possessive protectiveness that suggested personal investment in maintaining order. "Men like these bring trouble that spreads to everyone who lives up here." The answer revealed more than its words explicitly stated. Marcus had established himself as a guardian of sorts for the scattered homesteads and mining camps that dotted the Colorado high country, using his unique skills to maintain the fragile peace that allowed civilization to take root in the wilderness. The raiders' systematic attacks threatened that balance and demanded response from someone with the capability to provide it. As morning light fully illuminated the clearing, Rebecca and Marcus began the grim task of dealing with the aftermath of the battle that had saved her life but transformed her mountain refuge into something very different from the peaceful sanctuary she had built. The immediate danger was over, but the broader implications of the night's violence would require decisions that neither had anticipated when the sun set on what should have been just another quiet evening in the Colorado wilderness. The horses that had carried the raiders represented immediate practical decisions about property and justice, while the bodies of their former owners required burial that would eliminate evidence of violence from Rebecca's homestead. More complex questions involved the broader pattern of raids that had brought this threat to her door, and the likelihood that additional criminals might follow the same trails that had guided their predecessors. Marcus's presence provided security and expertise that Rebecca desperately needed, but it also introduced complications that her isolated existence had avoided. The tracker represented connection to the outside world and its conflicts, knowledge of threats she had never imagined, and capabilities that might prove essential for future survival in mountains that no longer seemed as safe as they once had. Desperate journey that had begun with raiders attacking her cabin was far from over, though its character had changed dramatically with Marcus's intervention. What lay ahead would test both of them in ways that the night's violence had only begun to suggest. as forces beyond their control shaped decisions that would determine whether Rebecca's mountain sanctuary could be restored, or whether survival would require abandoning everything she had built in these dangerous but beautiful high country peaks. The work of clearing the battlefield began in methodical silence as Rebecca and Marcus faced the grim practicalities that followed violence. 6 bodies lay scattered across the clearing, their presence transforming her peaceful homestead into a scene that would haunt her dreams for months to come. Marcus approached each corpse with professional detachment, searching for identification and removing weapons with the efficiency of someone who had performed similar tasks many times before. "Better to know who they were," Marcus explained as he examined papers found in Jake Morrison's coat pocket. "These raids didn't start here, and they might not end here either." Rebecca watched from the cabin's doorway as Marcus gathered intelligence from the dead raiders, her mind struggling to process the rapid transformation from peaceful mountain existence to deadly combat and its aftermath. The man who had saved her life moved with quiet competence that suggested extensive experience with violence and its consequences, yet his manner toward her remained respectful and surprisingly gentle. The documents Marcus discovered painted a picture of systematic criminal activity that extended far beyond the attacks on isolated homesteads. Jake Morrison had carried detailed notes about mining camps, supply routes, and wealthy prospectors, along with a crude map marking locations throughout the Colorado Territory. The raiders had been operating as an organized gang with ambitious plans for expanding their criminal activities. "They were scouting for bigger targets," Marcus observed, studying the map while Rebecca examined the list of potential victims. "Your place and the Carlsons were just practice runs, testing their methods before hitting the mining camps with real money." The revelation that her ordeal had been merely a rehearsal for larger crimes added another layer of violation to Rebecca's sense of violated security. She and the Carlson family had been sacrificed to test techniques these men planned to use against other innocent people, their lives considered expendable in service of criminal ambition that stretched across half the territory. Marcus's investigation revealed additional disturbing details about the raiders' background and connections. Several carried discharge papers from Union Army units, suggesting they were former soldiers who had adapted military skills to criminal purposes after the war's end. Others bore the weathered appearance of failed prospectors whose dreams of easy wealth had soured into predatory desperation. "War ended 2 years ago," Marcus noted, studying the military documents. "Lot of men came west looking for new starts, but some brought bad habits with them." Rebecca had heard similar stories in Silverbrook, where former soldiers drifted through mining camps seeking opportunities that often proved elusive. The economic disruption following the war had created a population of displaced men with military training but few prospects for legitimate employment, some of whom inevitably turned to crime when honest work proved insufficient for their needs or expectations. The practical task of disposing of the bodies required decisions that tested both their moral sensibilities and their understanding of frontier justice. Official law enforcement existed primarily in larger towns like Denver, while isolated areas like Rebecca's Mountain Sanctuary operated under informal codes that emphasized practical solutions over legal procedures. Sheriff in Silverbrook couldn't get up here before spring, even if he wanted to, Marcus pointed out as they debated their options. "Bodies will attract scavengers if we leave them, but burying them proper takes time we might not have." The dilemma reflected the harsh realities of frontier life, where survival often required choices that more civilized environments could avoid. Rebecca's Christian upbringing argued for decent burial even for enemies, but practical considerations suggested that time and effort might be better spent preparing for additional threats that could follow the same trails the raiders had used. Marcus proposed a compromise that balanced moral obligations with practical necessities. They would bury the bodies in a common grave at the forest edge, marking the location but avoiding the elaborate ceremony that circumstances made impossible. The task would require most of the day, but would eliminate the immediate problem while allowing them to focus on more pressing concerns about future security. The physical labor of digging graves in mountain soil proved exhausting work that provided unwelcome time for Rebecca to contemplate the violence she had witnessed and participated in. Her hands, accustomed to gentler tasks like teaching and gardening, now bore blisters from shovel work and the memory of taking human life in defense of her own. The transformation felt profound and irreversible. Marcus worked alongside her with steady endurance that seemed unaffected by the previous night's exertions or the emotional weight of the morning's discoveries. His comfort with violence and its aftermath suggested a background that Rebecca was only beginning to understand, though his respectful behavior toward her provided reassurance that his deadly skills were guided by moral principles rather than mere expedience. "You've done this before," Rebecca observed as they completed the burial work, noting Marcus's familiarity with tasks that were entirely new to her experience. "More times than I'd prefer," he replied, his tone carrying weariness. "That went beyond physical fatigue. Territory's got plenty of men who figure guns solve problems better than words or work." The admission provided insight into Marcus's life and the circumstances that had shaped his skills and perspectives. As a tracker and guide in Colorado's wilderness, he regularly encountered the violent men who gravitated toward areas where official authority remained weak and personal. Justice often represented the only available protection. Their conversation during the long day's work revealed the complex background that had prepared Marcus for his role as protector of the mountain territories. Born to a Cherokee mother and Scottish father in Arkansas, he had grown up between cultures that offered different strengths, but complete acceptance by neither. His mixed heritage provided advantages in surviving frontier conditions while creating social isolation that paralleled Rebecca's own experience of displacement from conventional community structures. The Cherokee side of his family had taught Marcus skills in tracking, hunting, and moving through natural terrain that few white men ever mastered. His father's Scottish heritage contributed tactical thinking and technological knowledge that enhanced those natural abilities. The combination created capabilities that surpassed what either culture could provide alone, though it also ensured that Marcus would always remain somewhat apart from both. "Mother's people were forced out of Arkansas when I was 15, Marcus explained as they worked to complete the graves before darkness fell. "Took the Indian removal trail west, but I stayed behind with my father's family." The decision to remain in Arkansas rather than accompany his mother's people on their forced relocation had cost Marcus his connection to the Cherokee community, while never quite providing full acceptance among his father's Scottish-American relatives. He had learned to survive between worlds, developing skills that served frontier territories, but left him fundamentally alone despite his value to others. His journey to Colorado had begun 5 years earlier when economic opportunities in Arkansas dried up and social pressures made his mixed heritage increasingly uncomfortable for neighbors who preferred clear racial categories. The mining boom in Colorado Territory offered work for someone with his tracking and hunting abilities, while the fluid social conditions of frontier settlement provided more tolerance for unconventional backgrounds. Rebecca found herself studying Marcus with growing interest as his story emerged through their shared labor. His experience of displacement and cultural isolation paralleled her own sense of existing between the conventional expectations of women in frontier society and her determination to maintain independence that defied those expectations. Both had found ways to survive outside normal community structures, though their methods differed significantly. The afternoon brought unexpected complications when Marcus discovered tracks indicating that additional riders had approached the clearing during the previous day but had departed without making contact. The sign was subtle, easily missed by someone without his expertise, but clear evidence that the raiders' activities had been observed by unknown parties, who might represent either additional threats or potential sources of information. 3. Horses shod, Marcus reported after studying the tracks carefully. Came close enough to see what was happening, then turned back toward the main trail. The discovery raised disturbing questions about who else might know about the attack on Rebecca's homestead and what their intentions might be regarding the aftermath. If the observers were associated with the raiders, their departure might indicate plans to bring reinforcements or report the gang's failure to hire authorities. If they were innocent travelers, they might carry word of the violence to Silverbrook or other communities. Rebecca felt her sense of security, already shattered by the night's events, deteriorate further as she contemplated the implications of unknown observers who had witnessed her ordeal without intervening. The mountain sanctuary that had once seemed protected by its isolation now felt exposed to scrutiny from forces she couldn't identify or control. Could be miners heading back to camp, Marcus suggested, though his tone indicated uncertainty about the reassuring interpretation. Or could be trouble we haven't seen yet. The ambiguity reflected the broader uncertainty that now characterized Rebecca's situation. The immediate threat had been eliminated, but the circumstances that had brought raiders to her mountain homestead remained largely unknown. Additional criminals might follow the same trails, official authorities might investigate the violence, or other complications might emerge from the connections the raiders had established throughout the territory. As evening approached, Rebecca and Marcus completed their grim tasks and returned to the cabin to address more immediate concerns about food, shelter, and security. The building had suffered damage during the siege, with broken windows and bullet holes that would require repair before winter weather arrived. More critically, the psychological sanctuary the cabin had represented was gone, replaced by a structure that would forever carry memories of violence and terror. Marcus examined the damage with the practical eye of someone accustomed to improvising solutions from available materials. The windows could be temporarily sealed with oiled paper and boards, while the bullet holes in the log walls required chinking with clay and moss to prevent heat loss during cold weather. The repairs were within his capabilities, though they would require time and materials that might be needed for other purposes. Place can be made secure again, he assured Rebecca as they surveyed the destruction, but it'll never feel quite the same. The observation touched the heart of Rebecca's dilemma about her future in the mountain homestead. The physical structure could be repaired, and the defensive measures could be improved, but the sense of peace and safety that had made isolation bearable was gone. She faced choices about whether to remain in a place forever associated with terror or to abandon the life she and Thomas had built together. Their discussion of practical matters gradually evolved into more personal conversation as they prepared a simple meal from Rebecca's supplies and Marcus's trail provisions. The shared experience of violence and survival had created an intimacy that bypassed the usual social formalities, allowing them to speak with unusual directness about subjects that might otherwise require longer acquaintance. Marcus's presence in her cabin felt both natural and strange, offering security she desperately needed while representing a level of male companionship she had avoided since Thomas's death. His respectful behavior and obvious competence provided reassurance, but Rebecca remained aware that accepting his protection involved dependencies that her hard-won independence made her reluctant to embrace. "You don't have to stay," she told him as they shared the evening meal by lamplight. "You've done more than enough already." Marcus considered her words while studying the maps and documents he had taken from the raiders, his expression thoughtful as he weighed options that involved considerations beyond simple courtesy. "These men had connections throughout the territory," he replied finally. "Killing them might bring attention you'd rather avoid." The practical observation highlighted complexities that Rebecca had not fully considered in her relief at surviving the immediate threat. Law enforcement officials might investigate the deaths, even if they ultimately concluded that self-defense justified the killing. Criminal associates might seek revenge or attempt to continue the raiders' work. Federal authorities might take interest in violence involving military veterans turned to crime. Besides, Marcus added with a slight smile that transformed his usually serious features, winter's coming on fast up here. Wouldn't be neighborly to leave a lady to face the mountains alone. The offer was phrased casually, but Rebecca understood its significance, both for her immediate security and for the broader question of how she would survive in an environment that had proven more dangerous than she had realized. Marcus's skills and knowledge provided capabilities she desperately needed, while his company offered relief from the isolation that had become oppressive rather than peaceful. Yet accepting his protection would require adjustments to the independent existence she had fought to maintain since Thomas's death. Sharing her mountain sanctuary with a man whose background and capabilities she was only beginning to understand involved risks that went beyond simple questions of propriety or social convention. As darkness settled over the mountains and they prepared sleeping arrangements that acknowledged both practical necessities and appropriate boundaries, Rebecca faced decisions that would shape not only her immediate survival but the entire future of the life she had built in Colorado's high country. The unexpected encounter with Marcus Whitehorse had saved her from certain death, but it had also introduced complications that would test everything she thought she knew about independence, trust, and the possibility of finding connection in a world that seemed determined to remain hostile to her aspirations. The night sounds that had once provided comfort now carried undertones of potential threat, while the presence of a man whose deadly skills had proven necessary for her survival created its own complex emotional responses. Rebecca lay awake, listening to Marcus's quiet breathing from his position near the door, grateful for his protection while wrestling with questions about what accepting that protection might ultimately cost her hard-won autonomy and self-reliance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they addressed the practical implications of the night's violence and the broader questions about security in mountains that no longer seemed as isolated as they once had. The relationship between Rebecca and Marcus, forged in violence and tested by shared survival, would need to develop beyond crisis response into something sustainable that honored both their needs for safety and their respective requirements for maintaining dignity and independence in a frontier environment that offered few models for unconventional partnerships. The first week after the raid established patterns that would define Rebecca and Marcus's evolving partnership through the critical weeks before winter's arrival. Each morning began with Marcus conducting a careful reconnaissance of the surrounding terrain, checking for signs of additional threats while Rebecca tended to the livestock and assessed damage that required ongoing repair. Their separate tasks gradually merged into coordinated effort as they learned to anticipate each other's needs and capabilities. Marcus's knowledge of mountain survival extended far beyond the tracking and combat skills that had saved Rebecca's life. He understood weather patterns with the precision of someone whose existence depended on accurate prediction, reading signs in cloud formations and wind direction that allowed him to anticipate storms days before they arrived. This expertise proved invaluable as they prepared the homestead for winter conditions that would isolate them completely from outside assistance. "Storm coming in from the northwest," Marcus announced on the fifth morning after the attack, studying the sky with practiced attention to subtle changes in light and air pressure. "Big one, by the look of it. We've got maybe 2 days to finish the critical work." Rebecca had learned to trust his weather predictions absolutely after witnessing their consistent accuracy. Her own knowledge of seasonal patterns, gained through 3 years of mountain living, seemed elementary compared to Marcus's ability to interpret natural signs that remained invisible to her less experienced observation. She followed his gaze toward distant peaks where clouds gathered with ominous intensity. The repairs they had been completing at measured pace suddenly became urgent priorities as they faced the prospect of being confined together during the first major storm of the season. The cabin's bullet-damaged windows required immediate attention, while the chinked log walls needed additional insulation against cold that would test every weakness in their defensive preparations. Working side by side, through the shortened daylight hours, Rebecca discovered aspects of Marcus's background that his reserved nature had kept hidden during their initial acquaintance. His skill with tools reflected training that went beyond simple frontier competence, incorporating techniques learned from Cherokee craftsmen and Scottish stonemasons who had shaped his early education in practical arts. Father was a builder. Back in Arkansas, Marcus explained as he fitted new glass into the front window with careful precision. Thought I should learn honest work before learning to fight or hunt. The glass had come from supplies Thomas had ordered but never used, carefully wrapped and stored in the root cellar against future need. Marcus's installation technique created a seal that would withstand mountain weather while providing clear visibility for defensive observation. His work combined functionality with an aesthetic sense that elevated necessity into modest beauty. Rebecca found herself studying Marcus's hands as he worked, noting the scars that marked encounters with violence alongside calluses earned through honest labor. The Cherokee influence appeared in his economy of movement and intuitive understanding of materials, while Scottish heritage showed in his methodical approach to problems requiring systematic solutions. The combination created capabilities that seemed almost magical to someone raised in more conventional circumstances. Their conversations during shared work revealed the isolation that had shaped both their lives in different but parallel ways. Rebecca's displacement from conventional female roles through education and widowhood found echo in Marcus's position between cultures that offered partial acceptance but never complete belonging. Both had learned to survive outside normal community structures, developing self-reliance that made their partnership valuable, precisely because neither demanded what the other couldn't provide. Teaching must have been lonely work in a place like Whispering Pines, Marcus observed as they carried firewood to replenish stores depleted during the siege preparation. People out here don't always value book learning the way they should. Rebecca considered his assessment while stacking split logs with the efficiency she had learned during months of solitary maintenance. Loneliness came more from being widowed than from teaching, she replied thoughtfully. Students were eager to learn. Their parents were the ones who decided education was less important than conformity. The distinction reflected her growing understanding of how social pressures operated differently in frontier communities, where practical skills often received higher value than intellectual development. Marcus's respect for her educational background provided validation that had been absent from her interactions with Silverbrook's residents, who viewed her teaching as acceptable occupation for married women, but suspicious activity for widows. Marcus's own education had been irregular but remarkably broad, combining Cherokee oral tradition with Scottish literacy and practical knowledge gained through years of frontier survival. He spoke 3 languages fluently, understood legal principles governing territorial disputes, and possessed enough medical knowledge to treat injuries common to wilderness life. His learning had been driven by necessity rather than formal schooling, but its practical application often exceeded what Rebecca's college education had provided. The storm Marcus had predicted arrived with devastating force on the 7th night after the raid, bringing winds that howled through the mountain passes and snow that fell in thick sheets obscuring visibility beyond the cabin's windows. Rebecca and Marcus found themselves confined together in the single room that served as their entire world, while nature demonstrated its power to isolate and threaten even well-prepared settlements. The enforced intimacy of storm shelter tested both their developing friendship and their respective needs for personal space and privacy. The cabin that had seemed adequate for Rebecca's solitary existence felt cramped with 2 occupants, while the social protocols appropriate for their unusual partnership remained unclear and undefined. They navigated these challenges with careful courtesy that acknowledged both practical necessities and appropriate boundaries. Marcus had positioned his sleeping area near the door, maintaining his role as protector while respecting Rebecca's privacy and autonomy. His presence provided security that allowed her to sleep peacefully for the first time since the attack, yet his continued vigilance served as constant reminder of the dangers that had transformed her mountain sanctuary from refuge into fortress. The storm's 3-day duration, they developed routines that maximized comfort while minimizing friction in their confined quarters. Marcus maintained the fire and handled outdoor tasks that required venturing into the blizzard, while Rebecca managed cooking and indoor maintenance with efficiency gained through months of solitary practice. Their separate skills complemented each other perfectly, creating domestic harmony that neither had anticipated. The Cherokee stories Marcus shared during the long evening hours provided entertainment that transcended their immediate circumstances while offering insights into worldviews that Rebecca had never encountered. His narrative technique combined dramatic presentation with moral instruction, creating experiences that educated while they entertained. The stories revealed cultural values that emphasized harmony with natural forces rather than domination over them. Grandmother Spider brought fire to the people, Marcus recounted as wind rattled the cabin's walls and snow piled against the windows. Not by fighting the spirits who guarded it, but by understanding their nature and working with their purposes. The tale resonated with Rebecca's own experience of survival through adaptation rather than confrontation. Her success in maintaining the mountain homestead had come through learning to work with seasonal rhythms and natural limitations rather than attempting to impose inappropriate solutions on wilderness conditions. Marcus's stories validated approaches to problems that her formal education had not emphasized. Rebecca reciprocated by sharing literature that had shaped her intellectual development, reading aloud from Thomas's small library during hours when the storm made other activities impossible. Marcus listened with keen attention to poetry and prose that opened windows into cultural experiences far removed from his frontier existence, though his responses revealed sophisticated understanding of themes and techniques that surprised her. With their insight, Shakespeare understood power, Marcus commented after Rebecca finished reading selected scenes from Macbeth. How it corrupts those who seek it and destroys those who achieve it through violence. The observation demonstrated analytical capabilities that formal education might have refined but had not created. Marcus possessed natural intelligence that had been sharpened through practical application and guided by Cherokee wisdom tradition that emphasized understanding human nature in all its complexity. His insights often exceeded those of Rebecca's college-educated peers and Whispering Pines. The storm's intensity forced them to confront questions about their future partnership that might otherwise have been postponed until less immediate circumstances allowed careful consideration. Survival required cooperation that went beyond simple courtesy, creating interdependence that neither had sought, but both found increasingly comfortable and valuable. "This arrangement working for you?" Marcus asked directly as the storm began to abate on the third day, his tone carefully neutral to avoid pressuring Rebecca toward any particular response. Rebecca considered the question while watching snow continue to fall outside the cabin's repaired windows. The past few days had demonstrated how well they functioned as partners, combining their different strengths to create security and comfort that exceeded what either could achieve alone. Yet accepting permanent partnership would require abandoning the independence she had fought to maintain since Thomas's death. "Better than I expected," she admitted honestly. "You're easy company for someone who's used to solitude." The compliment acknowledged the respect and consideration Marcus had shown throughout their forced intimacy, never presuming on their circumstances or making her feel threatened despite his obvious physical capabilities. His behavior provided a sharp contrast to the assumptions most men made about women in vulnerable positions. Treating her as an equal partner rather than a burden requiring protection, Marcus's expression revealed satisfaction with her assessment, though he maintained the careful reserve that characterized his approach to personal relationships. "Mountain winters are hard on people alone," he observed. "Sharing the load makes sense for both of us." The practical framing allowed them to acknowledge their growing partnership without forcing premature decisions about its ultimate scope or duration. Both understood that successful cooperation during crisis situations didn't necessarily translate into permanent compatibility, though their early experience suggested promising potential for deeper connection if circumstances continued to develop favorably. When the storm finally passed, leaving the mountain landscape transformed by 3 feet of new snow, Rebecca and Marcus emerged from their temporary confinement with heightened appreciation for each other's company and renewed determination to prepare thoroughly for the longer isolation that winter would bring. The enforced intimacy had tested their compatibility under stress and proven that they could share confined quarters without friction or conflict. The world outside the cabin appeared pristine and beautiful under its blanket of fresh snow, but Marcus's experienced eye noted signs that concerned him as he conducted his first reconnaissance since the storm's arrival. Animal tracks revealed movement patterns that suggested predators had been driven to lower elevations by the severe weather, while distant smoke indicated other humans had also survived the blizzard and resumed activities that might affect their mountain sanctuary. "Wolves coming down from the high country," Marcus reported after completing his survey of the immediate area. "Storm drove the game to lower elevations, and hunters follow their prey." The information added another layer of concern to their security planning, as large predators pose different challenges from human threats, but required equally serious precautions. Marcus's tracking abilities would prove essential for monitoring wildlife movements and ensuring that their livestock remained protected from animals desperate enough to challenge human defenders. Rebecca found herself increasingly grateful for Marcus's presence as she contemplated facing such challenges alone. Her rifle skills and general competence would have been insufficient against the complex threats that mountain survival presented during harsh weather conditions. The partnership that had begun as temporary necessity was evolving into mutual dependence that served both their practical needs and their deeper requirements for companionship and emotional support. The week following the storm established new routines that acknowledged their partnership's permanent character, while maintaining appropriate boundaries and mutual respect. They worked together seamlessly, dividing responsibilities according to their respective strengths, while supporting each other in tasks that required cooperative effort. The mountain homestead began to feel like shared refuge rather than Rebecca's personal sanctuary temporarily occupied by a helpful stranger. Marcus's improvements to the cabin's defenses went beyond simple repairs to include enhancements that reflected his professional understanding of security requirements. He installed shutters that could seal the windows completely while allowing defensive firing through concealed ports, strengthened the door with additional bracing that would resist forced entry, and created secondary escape routes that would allow safe exit if the main entrance became compromised. "Hope we never need these preparations," Marcus explained as he completed work on a concealed tunnel that connected the root cellar to an exit point in the nearby forest. But hoping isn't the same as planning. Rebecca appreciated both the practical value of his security improvements and the thoughtfulness that had guided their implementation. Marcus had enhanced her home's defensive capabilities without making it feel like an armed fortress, maintaining the aesthetic qualities that made the cabin comfortable for daily living while preparing for threats that might never materialize. Their partnership had developed beyond crisis response into genuine collaboration that honored both their needs for security and their mutual respect for each other's independence and capabilities. The deepening bond between them was based on demonstrated compatibility under stress rather than romantic attraction, though Rebecca increasingly recognized that practical partnership might evolve into something deeper if their circumstances continued to develop favorably. As November advanced toward December, and winter tightened its grip on the Colorado high country, Rebecca and Marcus faced the prospect of extended isolation together with confidence, born of successful cooperation and growing understanding of each other's character and needs. Whatever challenges the long winter months might bring, they would face them as true partners whose combined strengths exceeded what either could achieve alone in the unforgiving mountain environment that had become their shared home. The riders appeared on the horizon 3 weeks before Christmas, their dark silhouettes stark against snow-covered peaks as they wound their way up the mountain trail toward Rebecca's sanctuary. Marcus spotted them first during his morning reconnaissance, counting 8 mounted figures, moving with military precision that immediately distinguished them from casual travelers or desperate criminals seeking easy targets. Federal marshals. Marcus determined after studying the approaching party through Thomas's field glasses. Too organized for territorial law, too well equipped for local authority. Rebecca felt cold dread settle in her stomach as she watched the distant riders negotiate the treacherous mountain path with determined persistence. Federal involvement meant their carefully constructed isolation was ending, replaced by official scrutiny that would question every aspect of their partnership and demand explanations for the violence that had brought them together. The documents Marcus had taken from the dead raiders suggested connections that extended far beyond simple criminal activity. Jake Morrison's papers had revealed systematic intelligence gathering about territorial mining operations, military supply routes, and political figures whose activities interested parties with resources and organization beyond what ordinary outlaws possessed. The dead gang had been part of something larger and more dangerous than random frontier crime. "They're not coming for a social call," Marcus observed, his tone carrying grim certainty about the complications their arrival would bring. "Someone back east wants answers about what happened here." Rebecca understood the implications immediately. Federal marshals represented authority that superseded territorial law and local custom, carrying mandates that could override any arrangements she and Marcus had developed for their mutual survival. Their partnership, however practical and beneficial, violated social conventions that federal officials would feel obligated to address, regardless of circumstances that had created the situation. The approaching riders would reach the cabin by late afternoon, providing several hours for Rebecca and Marcus to prepare their response to official inquiry that could not be avoided or deflected. They faced questions about the raiders' deaths, about their ongoing partnership, and about their possession of documents and property taken from men whose criminal activities apparently extended beyond territorial boundaries. Marcus's mixed heritage presented additional complications that territorial politics made increasingly dangerous. Federal policy toward Native Americans remained hostile despite individual relationships that transcended racial boundaries, while his position between cultures made him vulnerable to suspicions from authorities who preferred clear categories over complex realities. His presence at Rebecca's homestead could be interpreted as threat rather than protection by officials predisposed to view such arrangements with skepticism. "Maybe you should leave before they arrive," Rebecca suggested, recognizing the danger that official attention might bring to someone whose survival depended on avoiding the scrutiny that formal investigation inevitably involved. Marcus considered her proposal while checking his weapons and assessing escape routes that would allow departure without confrontation if circumstances made withdrawal advisable. The suggestion reflected practical concern for his safety rather than desire to face the approaching authorities alone, but it also acknowledged realities that their developing partnership had temporarily allowed them to ignore. "Running makes me look guilty of something," Marcus replied after careful thought. Better to meet them straight up and let the facts speak for themselves. The decision reflected courage that Rebecca admired while recognizing its potential costs. Marcus was choosing to trust in justice and official fairness despite Years of experience that suggested such trust was often misplaced when dealing with authorities whose prejudices shaped their interpretation of facts. His willingness to risk official retribution rather than abandon her demonstrated loyalty that went beyond practical partnership. Their preparation for the official visit involved careful arrangement of evidence and coordination of the story they would present to investigators whose priorities might differ significantly from their own understanding of events. The raiders' documents would support their version of defensive action, while the buried bodies provided physical evidence of the threat they had faced together. Rebecca found herself rehearsing explanations that would satisfy official inquiry, while protecting the partnership she had come to value above conventional social approval. The truth of their relationship was more complex than simple categories allowed, combining practical cooperation with growing emotional connection that transcended the crisis circumstances that had brought them together. The federal party that finally arrived at the cabin represented authority with broader implications than Rebecca had anticipated. U.S. Marshal William Hartford led a contingent that included 2 deputy marshals, a federal prosecutor, a military intelligence officer, and a clerk whose presence suggested official proceedings would be documented with bureaucratic thoroughness. Marshal Hartford presented himself with formal courtesy that failed to conceal the suspicion with which he regarded the unusual domestic arrangement his investigation had uncovered. A veteran of territorial law enforcement, he possessed experience with frontier violence but little sympathy for unconventional partnerships that challenged established social boundaries. Mrs. Morrison, Hartford greeted Rebecca with reserved politeness as she emerged from the cabin to meet the official party. "I understand you've had considerable excitement up here recently." Rebecca responded with dignity that neither apologized for her circumstances nor challenged official authority unnecessarily. "Marshal Hartford, welcome to my home. I assume you're here about the men who attacked us last month." The use of "us" rather than "me" immediately established the partnership that Hartford had come to investigate, forcing early acknowledgement of Marcus's role in events rather than allowing officials to frame the situation according to their preconceptions. Rebecca's directness signaled that she would cooperate with the investigation while maintaining control over the narrative they heard. Marcus emerged from the cabin behind Rebecca, presenting himself as an equal partner rather than subordinate or hired help. His calm demeanor and obvious competence challenged stereotypes that Hartford might have held about relationships between white women and men of mixed heritage in frontier circumstances. "You would be Marcus Whitehorse," Hartford stated, consulting notes that revealed the extent of federal knowledge about their situation. "Army records indicate you've served as guide and translator for territorial expeditions." The acknowledgement of Marcus's military service provided unexpected legitimacy that shifted Hartford's initial assessment of the situation. Federal authorities understood the value of skilled scouts and guides, while Marcus's official service record created a presumption of reliability that criminal associations would have undermined completely. Hartford's investigation proceeded with methodical thoroughness that revealed both professional competence and predetermined conclusions about acceptable behavior for women in frontier situations. He examined the burial site, studied the documents taken from the raiders, and questioned both Rebecca and Marcus about events leading to the confrontation that had resulted in 6 deaths. The prosecutor, a thin man named Collins whose Eastern dress marked him as unfamiliar with frontier realities, focused particularly on Rebecca's decision to remain at the homestead after the attack rather than seeking protection in more conventional circumstances. His questions carried implicit criticism of choices that defied social expectations for widowed women facing dangerous situations. "Surely you understood that continuing to live alone in such isolation invited additional attacks," Collins suggested during his interrogation of Rebecca's decisions. "A woman in your circumstances might reasonably be expected to seek safer accommodation." Rebecca's response reflected months of successful independent living that had proven her capability to survive frontier conditions without male protection or conventional community support. Mr. Collins, I built this home with my late husband and have maintained it successfully for over a year since his death. The attack was criminal behavior, not an inevitable consequence of my living arrangements. The exchange illustrated fundamental disagreements about women's capabilities and proper roles that federal officials brought to their assessment of Rebecca's situation. Their investigation proceeded from assumptions about female helplessness and male authority that frontier realities often contradicted, but that official policy continued to enforce. Marcus's testimony provided crucial context about the raiders' systematic approach and their connections to broader criminal activities that extended throughout territorial mining regions. His professional knowledge of tracking and criminal behavior supported Rebecca's account while demonstrating the serious nature of threats they had faced together. These men were operating as an organized gang with an intelligence network covering half the territory, Marcus explained as he showed Hartford the maps and notes taken from Jake Morrison's body. Isolated homesteads were just practice targets for larger operations against mining camps and supply convoys. The intelligence officer, Captain Reynolds, showed particular interest in documents that revealed military connections among the raiders and suggested coordination with Confederate sympathizers who remained active in territorial politics. The information transformed local criminal activity into potential federal security concerns that elevated the importance of Marcus and Rebecca's defensive action. How many of these men had military training? Reynolds asked, studying discharge papers that indicated service in Union Army units that had been disbanded under questionable circumstances. Marcus's detailed knowledge of the raiders' background proved valuable to federal investigation, while establishing his credibility as a witness whose observations deserved serious consideration. His ability to provide intelligence that officials needed created unexpected leverage in negotiations about his future relationship with Rebecca. The federal party established a temporary camp near the cabin, conducting interviews and gathering evidence that would support official reports about criminal activities and their disruption. Hartford's investigation gradually revealed appreciation for the courage and competence both Rebecca and Marcus had demonstrated in confronting threats that territorial law enforcement had been unable to address effectively. Yet official approval of their defensive actions did not extend to acceptance of their ongoing partnership, which continued to violate social conventions that federal policy was expected to uphold. Hartford's growing respect for their individual capabilities conflicted with institutional pressures to restore conventional arrangements that would satisfy Eastern authorities concerned about frontier morality. Mrs. Morrison, your courage in defending your property is commendable, Hartford acknowledged during a private conversation on the investigation's second day. However, your continued association with Mr. Whitehorse creates complications that federal authority cannot simply ignore. Rebecca recognized the diplomatic phrasing that concealed official determination to separate partners, whose relationship challenged racial and social boundaries that government policy was designed to maintain. Federal approval of their defensive cooperation did not extend to tolerance for domestic arrangements that defied conventional expectations. Marshall Hartford, Mr. Whitehorse, saved my life and has proven himself a reliable partner in maintaining this homestead, Rebecca replied with quiet firmness. I fail to see how our mutual cooperation creates complications for federal authority. The response forced Hartford to articulate prejudices that official policy preferred to leave unstated, challenging him to justify intervention in arrangements that served legitimate purposes and harmed no one beyond satisfying bureaucratic preferences for conventional social organization. Collins, the federal prosecutor, proved less diplomatic. In expressing official concerns about relationships that crossed racial boundaries and violated gender expectations simultaneously, his interrogation revealed assumptions about white women's supposed vulnerability to Native American influence. that Rebecca's obvious competence and independence clearly contradicted. Prolonged association with individuals of mixed heritage can compromise judgment in ways that educated women might not recognize. Collins suggested with condescending concern that masked deeper prejudices about racial contamination and female susceptibility to inappropriate influences. Rebecca's response demonstrated intellectual capabilities that undermined Collins's paternalistic assumptions while asserting her right to make autonomous decisions about relationships and living arrangements. Mr. Collins, my judgment has been tested by circumstances that would challenge anyone's capabilities. I'm quite capable of evaluating the character and reliability of my associates. The exchange highlighted fundamental conflicts between individual liberty and social control that frontier conditions often brought into sharp focus. Federal officials represented authority structure that prioritized conformity over adaptation, while Rebecca and Marcus embodied frontier pragmatism that valued effectiveness over convention. Military intelligence officer Reynolds approached their partnership from different perspective, recognizing strategic value in relationships that bridged cultural boundaries and provided access to information that conventional sources might miss. His questions focused on territorial security concerns rather than social propriety, suggesting potential federal interest in Marcus's unique capabilities. Territory needs men who understand both white and Indian perspectives, Reynolds observed. During conversation that explored possibilities for official employment that might legitimize Marcus's position while serving federal interests. Your background provides qualifications that could prove valuable for territorial security operations. The suggestion offered a potential solution to official concerns about Marcus's irregular status, while providing employment that would utilize his skills in service of federal priorities. Such arrangement might allow continuation of his partnership with Rebecca, while satisfying bureaucratic requirements for official sanction of unconventional relationships. As the federal investigation progressed through its third day, the competing pressures of individual rights, social convention, and political necessity created complex negotiations that would determine the future of Rebecca and Marcus's carefully constructed mountain sanctuary. Official approval of their defensive actions provided a foundation for legitimacy, but broader questions about acceptable frontier relationships remained unresolved. The documents and intelligence that Marcus had gathered from the dead raiders proved increasingly valuable to federal authorities investigating criminal networks that threatened territorial development and federal policy implementation. His cooperation earned respect that might translate into protection for the partnership that officials had initially viewed with suspicion and disapproval. Rebecca found herself at the center of negotiations that would determine whether her hard-won independence could survive federal scrutiny, or whether official intervention would force abandonment of the life she had built through courage, competence, and determination. The mountain sanctuary that had provided refuge from conventional societies' limitations now faced invasion by the very authorities whose power she had sought to escape. The approaching resolution would test everything both she and Marcus had learned about survival, adaptation, and the possibility of creating authentic relationships that transcended the boundaries society sought to enforce. Their partnership faced its greatest challenge, not from criminal violence or natural dangers, but from civilized authority that demanded conformity to standards neither had chosen nor accepted willingly. The resolution came on the fourth morning of the federal investigation when Marshal Hartford received telegraphed orders from Denver that transformed the entire character of his mission. Captain Reynolds had submitted detailed reports about the criminal network his investigation had uncovered, emphasizing the intelligence value of Marcus's discoveries and the strategic importance of maintaining cooperative relationships with individuals who possessed unique qualifications for territorial security work. Washington wants this criminal investigation prioritized over social concerns, Hartford announced as he gathered his party for departure preparations. His tone carried professional acceptance of orders that overrode his personal preferences. About appropriate frontier relationships. Mr. Whitehorse's cooperation with federal authorities outweighs other considerations. Rebecca felt profound relief wash over her as she realized that official pressure to abandon her partnership with Marcus was being withdrawn in favor of pragmatic recognition of their mutual value to territorial security. The federal government's need for reliable intelligence sources had created protection for their unconventional arrangement that social prejudices alone could never have overcome. Marcus received the news with characteristic calm that concealed his own satisfaction at avoiding forced separation from the mountain sanctuary he had come to consider home. His agreement to serve as occasional federal scout and intelligence gatherer provided official legitimacy for his presence, while requiring minimal compromise of the independence both he and Rebecca valued above conventional security. Territories changing fast. Reynolds explained as he outlined the arrangement that would satisfy federal requirements while preserving their partnership. Need people who understand those changes from different perspectives. Your situation here provides a unique vantage point that could prove valuable for territorial development. The compromise recognized practical realities that rigid social conventions often ignored, acknowledging that frontier conditions required adaptations that Eastern authorities might find uncomfortable but could not afford to prohibit when they served legitimate federal interests. Rebecca and Marcus had earned their right to define their own relationship through demonstrated competence and courage that commanded official respect. Collins, the federal prosecutor, departed with obvious displeasure at arrangements that violated his conception of proper social order, but his objections carried no weight against military intelligence assessments that prioritized effective intelligence gathering over conventional morality. His disapproval served as a reminder that their victory was temporary and conditional, dependent on continued demonstration of value to federal priorities. "You've won a battle, not the war," Hartford warned Rebecca privately before his departure. Federal protection extends only as long as you remain useful to territorial interests. Changes in policy or personnel could revive official concerns about your situation. Rebecca understood the warning while appreciating the opportunity it represented to continue building the life she and Marcus had constructed together. Their partnership had survived its first major test from external authority, proving that courage and competence could sometimes overcome prejudice and convention when circumstances demanded practical solutions over ideological purity. The federal party's departure left Rebecca and Marcus alone again in their mountain sanctuary, but their isolation now carried a different meaning than it had possessed before official recognition of their arrangements. They remained apart from conventional society by choice rather than circumstance, protected by federal authority that valued their unique qualifications while allowing them to maintain the independence both had fought to preserve. Christmas arrived quietly that year, marked by snow-laden peaks and the comfortable routine of shared labor that had replaced Rebecca's solitary struggle for survival. She and Marcus exchanged simple gifts that reflected growing understanding of each other's needs and preferences, celebrating their partnership's endurance through challenges that might have destroyed less resilient cooperation. Marcus carved an intricate wooden box for Rebecca's precious books, incorporating Cherokee designs that honored her intellectual pursuits while reflecting his own cultural heritage. The craftsmanship demonstrated artistic capabilities that his reserved nature usually kept hidden, revealing talents that extended far beyond the practical skills that had initially defined their relationship. Rebecca presented Marcus with a hand-sewn shirt that combined practical durability with decorative elements drawn from Scottish tradition, acknowledging both sides of his heritage while providing clothing suitable for his work as federal scout and intelligence gatherer. Her needlework had improved dramatically during months of frontier living, transforming necessity into art that honored their partnership. Their quiet celebration reflected contentment that neither had expected to find in circumstances that had begun with violence and terror. The mountain sanctuary that Rebecca had built with Thomas now sheltered a different kind of partnership, one based on mutual respect and complementary capabilities rather than conventional romantic attachment or legal obligation. "Never figured I'd find peace in one place," Marcus observed as they shared Christmas dinner prepared from supplies they had gathered and preserved together. "Always thought I was meant to keep moving between worlds that didn't quite fit." Rebecca understood the profound significance of his admission, recognizing how their partnership had provided the stability and acceptance that his mixed heritage had made difficult to find elsewhere. Her own journey from conventional widow to independent frontier woman had been paralleled by his evolution from solitary tracker to valued partner in creating something unique and worthwhile. "Thomas and I built this place to be a sanctuary," Rebecca replied, raising her cup in toast to memories and possibilities. "Seems fitting that it should shelter people who need refuge from a world that insists on simple answers to complex questions." The observation captured the essence of what they had created together, a space where individual worth mattered more than social categories and where practical cooperation transcended the boundaries that conventional society sought to enforce. Their mountain homestead had become a laboratory for testing whether different approaches to human relationships could survive in environments that valued effectiveness over conformity. Winter's deepening isolation provided time for reflection on the journey that had brought them together and consideration of possibilities that spring might offer for expanding the foundation they had established. Marcus's federal connections opened opportunities for travel and engagement with territorial development that could utilize both their skills while maintaining their mountain base as refuge and sanctuary. Rebecca's teaching background complemented Marcus's intelligence-gathering capabilities in ways that federal authorities were beginning to recognize as valuable for understanding cultural tensions that threatened territorial stability. Their partnership offered a unique perspective on frontier conditions that single viewpoints often missed, providing insights that could inform policy decisions affecting thousands of settlers and Native Americans. Reynolds mentioned interest in cultural education programs, Marcus reported during one of their evening planning sessions. Federal government recognizes that most conflicts come from misunderstanding rather than genuine disagreement about resources or territory. The potential for Rebecca to resume teaching in contexts that would bridge cultural divisions rather than reinforce them represented fulfillment of purposes that her Whispering Pines experience had frustrated. Her education and Marcus's cultural knowledge could combine to create educational approaches that served federal pacification policies while honoring the dignity of all peoples affected by territorial expansion. Their discussions of future possibilities revealed how completely their individual goals had merged into shared vision that transcended what either could achieve alone. Rebecca's intellectual capabilities and Marcus's practical skills created synergy that enhanced both their potential contributions to territorial development and their personal satisfaction with the life they were building together. Spring's arrival brought confirmation that their winter planning had prepared them well for expanded engagement with the wider world beyond their mountain sanctuary. Marcus's first assignment as federal scout involved investigating tribal movements that threatened mining operations, while Rebecca received an invitation to consult on educational policies for territorial schools serving diverse populations. The work allowed them to contribute their unique qualifications to territorial development while maintaining the independence and partnership that official recognition had legitimized. They traveled together when assignments permitted, separated by duty when circumstances required, but always returned to the mountain homestead that remained their anchor and refuge. Their success in navigating federal expectations while preserving their unconventional relationship attracted attention from other individuals, seeking alternatives to rigid social conventions that frontier conditions often made impractical or harmful. The mountain sanctuary began to receive occasional visitors whose own circumstances defied easy categorization, creating an informal network of people committed to defining their own approaches to meaningful existence. A widowed schoolteacher from Denver seeking refuge from family pressure to remarry found temporary shelter, while establishing independent teaching practice in mining camps that welcomed female educators. A former Union officer whose war injuries had ended his military career, but whose tactical knowledge remained valuable, discovered purpose in training territorial militia units while recovering his sense of personal worth. Most significantly, a Cherokee family displaced by Oklahoma territorial policies found welcome and assistance in establishing their own homestead nearby, creating the beginning of intentional community based on mutual aid rather than cultural segregation. Rebecca and Marcus's partnership had demonstrated that cooperation across traditional boundaries could serve practical purposes while honoring individual dignity and cultural heritage. What we're building here matters beyond just ourselves, Rebecca observed as she watched Marcus help their Cherokee neighbors construct winter shelter using techniques that combine traditional methods with frontier adaptations. We're proving that different ways of living together are possible. The community that gradually developed around their mountain sanctuary represented a laboratory for testing social innovations that conventional settlements rarely attempted. Individual families maintained their independence, while sharing resources and knowledge that enhanced everyone's security and prosperity. Cultural differences were acknowledged and respected rather than suppressed or homogenized. Marcus's role as federal scout provided protection and legitimacy for the developing community, while ensuring that its activities remained within legal boundaries that territorial authorities would accept. His reports emphasized the peaceful and productive nature of their experimental settlement, documenting how cooperation across cultural lines could contribute to territorial stability rather than threatening it. Rebecca's educational work evolved to include training programs that prepared teachers for frontier schools serving diverse populations, sharing techniques she and Marcus had developed for bridging cultural differences through respectful inquiry and mutual learning. Her programs attracted attention from territorial officials, seeking practical solutions to educational challenges that conventional approaches had failed to address. Their partnership had become a model for possibilities that extended far beyond their individual circumstances, demonstrating how courage, competence, and mutual respect could overcome prejudices and conventions that limited human potential. The mountain sanctuary that had begun as Rebecca's isolated refuge had evolved into a center for innovation that attracted people committed to creating more inclusive and effective approaches to frontier community development. The transformation represented triumph not only of individual determination but of principles that honored human dignity regardless of gender, ethnicity, or conventional social status. Rebecca and Marcus had proven that authentic partnership, based on complementary strengths, could withstand external pressure, while creating value that extended beyond their personal satisfaction to benefit others seeking alternatives to rigid social constraints. As summer brought visitors seeking their guidance and assistance, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had carried her from abandoned widow facing death in Colorado's wilderness to respected educator and community leader whose work influenced territorial policy. The path had required courage she hadn't known. She possessed an adaptability that her conventional upbringing had never encouraged. Marcus's evolution from solitary tracker moving between worlds that offered partial acceptance to valued federal agent and community leader represented an equally dramatic transformation that had been made possible by partnership that transcended traditional boundaries. His unique qualifications had found purpose and appreciation in context that honored both sides of his heritage while utilizing his distinctive capabilities. Their love story, for that was what their partnership had ultimately become, differed from conventional narratives that emphasized romantic passion over practical compatibility and mutual respect. Their bond had been forged through shared survival, strengthened through cooperative labor, and deepened through recognition of each other's essential worth as individuals committed to creating something meaningful from challenging circumstances. The mountain sanctuary they shared had become a symbol of possibilities that existed for people willing to challenge conventional limitations while building relationships based on authentic appreciation for each other's capabilities and character. Their success demonstrated that love could take many forms, but its most enduring expression might be found in partnerships that enhanced both individuals' ability to contribute positively to the world around them. As autumn painted the Colorado peaks in brilliant colors, and their community prepared for another winter of mutual support and shared prosperity, Rebecca and Marcus looked toward a future that held promise for continued growth and development of the principles they had tested. Through years of cooperation and commitment, their foundation had been established through trial and proven through success, creating a platform for innovations that could influence territorial development for generations to come. The lone woman who had defended her cabin against raiders had become a leader of community that demonstrated alternative approaches to frontier living, while the half-breed tracker who had emerged from the forest had found purpose and acceptance that utilized his unique qualifications in service of peace and mutual understanding. Together they had created something unprecedented and valuable, proving that courage and determination could overcome any obstacle when guided by respect for human dignity and commitment to justice for all people seeking opportunity to build meaningful lives in America's expanding frontier territories. Years passed, and their mountain sanctuary evolved into something neither Rebecca nor Marcus had originally envisioned. What had begun as a desperate survival partnership had grown into a thriving community that attracted attention from territorial officials, Eastern newspapers, and policymakers seeking practical solutions to frontier challenges that conventional approaches had failed to address effectively. The Morrison Whitehorse settlement, as federal documents began to designate their community, became a testing ground for innovative approaches to education, agriculture, and cultural cooperation that influenced territorial development throughout Colorado and neighboring regions. Rebecca's educational programs trained teachers who carried her methods to schools across the frontier, while Marcus's intelligence work provided federal authorities with insights that prevented numerous conflicts between settlers and Native American communities. Their personal relationship deepened into a profound partnership that transcended categories of marriage, friendship, or business association, creating a bond based on mutual respect and shared purpose that served as foundation for everything they built together. They had discovered that love could be measured not only in emotional attachment, but in practical commitment to enhancing each other's capabilities and supporting each other's contributions to their community's welfare. The cabin that Rebecca had defended so desperately that October morning remained the center of their expanding settlement, preserved as a symbol of courage and determination that had made everything else possible. Visitors often asked to see the bullet holes and repaired windows that marked the battle that had brought Rebecca and Marcus together. Recognizing those scars as testament to human resilience and the power of unexpected alliances, Marcus established a formal tracking and guide service that employed both white and Native American scouts, creating economic opportunities while bridging cultural divisions that had previously seemed insurmountable. His reputation for fairness and competence attracted clients from throughout the territory, generating revenue that supported community development while demonstrating practical benefits of cooperation across traditional boundaries. Rebecca's influence extended beyond immediate community to territorial education policy, where her advocacy for inclusive curricula and respect for cultural diversity gradually transformed approaches to frontier schooling. Her writings on education and frontier life were published in Eastern magazines, bringing national attention to successful innovations that challenged prevailing assumptions about cultural conflict and assimilation. The success of their experimental community attracted scholarly attention from universities and government, agencies seeking to understand how peaceful coexistence could be achieved in regions where conflict had previously seemed inevitable. Researchers documented their methods and outcomes, creating academic foundation for policies that promoted cooperation rather than confrontation in frontier development. Most importantly, their example inspired others throughout the frontier territories to attempt similar innovations in community building and cultural cooperation. Letters arrived regularly from individuals and families seeking advice about establishing their own inclusive settlements, while visitors came to observe their methods and adapt them to different circumstances and environments. The Cherokee family, who had settled nearby, prospered through a combination of traditional agricultural techniques and frontier adaptations, their success attracting other displaced Native American families seeking alternatives to reservation life or cultural assimilation. The resulting multicultural community demonstrated that diversity could be a source of strength rather than division when guided by principles of mutual respect and practical cooperation. Rebecca and Marcus celebrated their 5th anniversary of partnership with a community festival that brought together settlers, Native Americans, federal officials, and visitors from distant territories to recognize achievements that had seemed impossible when their relationship began through violence and desperation. The celebration honored not only their personal success, but the broader possibilities their example had demonstrated for building more inclusive and effective frontier communities. As they stood together, watching children from different cultural backgrounds play together while their parents shared food and stories around communal fires, Rebecca and Marcus understood that their legacy would extend far beyond their individual lives. They had proven that courage, determination, and commitment to human dignity could overcome any obstacle while creating foundations for progress that honored everyone's contributions to America's expanding frontier. The mountain peaks that surrounded their sanctuary still rose magnificent and eternal, but the human community sheltered in their shadows had been permanently transformed by the choices two people had made to defend not only their lives but their right to define their own approaches to meaningful existence. Their story would be told for generations as an example of what became possible when fear was replaced by courage and prejudice was overcome by respect for human potential in all its diverse manifestations. Years later, when territorial historians compiled records of Colorado's development, the Morrison Whitehorse settlement would be recognized as a pioneering experiment in inclusive community building that influenced frontier policy throughout the American West. But for Rebecca and Marcus, the true measure of their success lay not in historical recognition, but in daily evidence that their mountain sanctuary continued to shelter people seeking refuge from a world that too often demanded conformity rather than celebrating the strength that diversity could provide. Their love story had become something larger than personal happiness, evolving into demonstration that authentic partnership could transform not only individual lives, but entire communities when guided by principles that honored human dignity regardless of background or circumstances. The cabin Rebecca had defended against raiders had become a symbol of possibilities that existed for anyone willing to stand against injustice while building alternatives based on courage, respect, and unwavering commitment to creating a better world for all people seeking opportunity to live with dignity and purpose. The mountain sanctuary they shared would continue to welcome those who sought refuge from conventional limitations, while offering examples of what could be achieved when human potential was freed from artificial constraints. Their foundation had been established through trial, proven through success, and would endure as testament to the power of love expressed through practical commitment to justice and mutual support in America's continuing journey toward fulfilling its promise of opportunity for all who were willing to work for freedom and dignity in their chosen homes. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.